Good morning, everyone. My name's Mark London. I head up the construction and engineering team here at Devonshires. I must confess, I thought I was going to be talking to you all for 45 minutes. So my slides and the length of them rather reflect that. I've been told I have a mere 10 to 15 minutes to talk to you. So I'm not going to cover most of the material in the slides, and my team and myself and others will be doing a series of seminars later in December and January to cover this topic in a lot more detail. But I'm going to talk to you about two things: the Building Safety Bill and the Fire Safety Bill. Now, let me talk a bit about the Fire Safety Bill to begin with, because the Fire Safety Bill has to a large extent been somewhat subsumed by the publicity and the interest that's been shown in the Building Safety Bill, quite rightly, not least because the Fire Safety Bill, for those of you who have read it, consists of about 4 paragraphs. And the Building Safety Bill is many hundreds of pages long if you include the commentary. But the Fire Safety Bill, certainly for building owners, and when I mean buildings of any height, not any multi-occupancy or multi-story building that isn't a bungalow or a single dwelling house, are going to have to get to grips with this piece of legislation, and it is a very significant piece of legislation, because those of you who are familiar with the Regulatory Reform Order will of course know that there is no requirement in its current state to inspect the external wall system and make a determination under Regulation 9 as to whether or not that external wall system is safe. Now, what the Fire Safety Bill does is it brings in the external wall system. It brings in fire doors as well, but most importantly, it brings in the external wall system, and it requires a fire risk assessor stroke fire engineer to carry out an inspection of that external wall system in order to determine whether it is safe. And one of the things that we have discovered over the past number of years is that it doesn't matter how tall a building is. The general sort of issues that we've found with quality of construction in external wall systems, particularly around the presence or otherwise of cavity barriers, particularly around windows and fitted to compression and all the rest of it, apply equally to buildings below 18 metres. And of course, we have far more in the range of timber frame construction in buildings under 18 metres, indeed under 11 metres. So what we are going to find inevitably when we start poking about in external wall systems for these buildings is that there are a significant number of defects. And in terms of determining whether or not the external wall system is safe, the only thing that the fire engineer or the fire risk assessor can really use to determine whether that external wall system is safe is to refer back to the functional requirements of the building regulations, and in particular B4, which talks about the spread of fire across the surface of the building having regard to its height and location, and B3, which is all about cavity barriers, ensuring that the passage of smoke and fire is prevented insofar as possible within unseen cavities. So although the Fire Safety Bill has not received as much publicity as perhaps it should have done, its consequences are astonishingly significant, both in terms of cost and in terms of the work that is going to have to be done where you have many hundreds, if not thousands, of these buildings. If we look at buildings generally, there are about 12,000 residential buildings over 18 metres in the UK. We build about 2,000 or 3,000 a year, and they're all going to be caught by the Building Safety Bill, as you know. The definition of tall buildings for the purposes of building regulations will almost certainly come down to 11 metres, as it is in Scotland, and it is likely in those circumstances that the definition of high-risk buildings for the purposes of the Building Safety Bill will also reduce to 11 metres. And that brings into scope another 4,000 to 5,000 buildings that will come under the auspices of the bill. But if you look at the Fire Safety Bill, there are hundreds of thousands of buildings that are within scope. And the amount of resource that is going to be necessary to carry out those fire risk assessments in relation to the external wall system, frankly, doesn't bear thinking about. And those of you who read the government's most recent press release on Friday will see that the government are investing an astonishingly large £700,000 to bring 2,000 building surveyors up to a standard where they can complete an EWS1 form within 6 months, and possibly also to contribute towards the body of people who will be able to carry out fire risk assessments on the external wall system. But I just wanted to mention that because that is a very significant new piece of legislation. Now, turning to the Building Safety Bill, I'm going to whiz through the bit about the construction phase, because I haven't got time to talk to you about that, and I'm going to go straight on to the occupation phase. And the reason I'm concentrating on this as opposed to the construction phase is that this is the stuff that bites in relation to existing buildings. You are going to have to complete a building safety case, and you are going to have to apply for your certificate to with an existing building. But nevertheless, this is the stuff that is as an accountable person you have to start thinking about now. So I'm going to very, very quickly run through this. Now, the regulator, who is the health and safety executive, has the following primary obligations in relation to higher risk buildings. Now, for the purposes of the current environment, higher risk building is a building over 18 metres or 6 stories in height. So buildings that are marginally below 18 metres but are still 6 stories in height will be caught by this bill. Now, the regulator has to meet the objectives, and those objectives are twofold. That is to secure the safety of persons in and around high-risk buildings, and also to ensure that the standard of buildings generally is improved. And that goes to everything. It goes to training, it goes to liaising with elements of the construction sector to make sure that they're doing things correctly. It's a sort of a general oversight role. The regulator is also encouraged to assist and encourage other duty holders and residents to keep their comply with their obligations under the bill. They have to keep under review risks arising from buildings, and there are many opportunities for the building safety regulator to liaise with the Secretary of State and to bring in secondary regulation to deal with issues that have arisen or may arise in the construction industry that need to be dealt with. And to improve the competence of the industry, which is something that we desperately need, frankly, particularly when we're talking about the construction of external wall systems. And also to constitute a national residence panel. Now, those of you who read the white paper that was published last week, and if you want a detailed a review of that, then go onto our website, and we have one on there, which I've contributed to in relation to the building safety element of it. The residence panel, there will be a national residence panel, and then there will be a residence panel that will have to be constituted by each accountable person for each higher risk building, and those residents are going to have a significant part to play in the way that decisions around the building are made in terms of health and safety. The regulator can call for assistance from the local authority, the fire rescue services, the idea being that everyone acknowledges that the resource that the building safety regulator is going to have on day one is not going to necessarily be as it should be, and therefore local authority, building control and the fire brigade are there to provide additional assistance where that is required. The regulator also has significant powers of enforcement. Now, the smorgasbord available to the building safety regulator is somewhat unprecedented in my view. Not only do they have new enforcement powers under the bill, but they can also rely upon the tried and tested enforcement powers in the Health and Safety at Work Act and the Building Act as amended, and those new amendments to the Building Act in terms of enforcement are very significant indeed. So the building safety regulator really does have an astonishing range of powers, and they're going to exercise these powers through a team of authorised officers. And those of you who've been reading the construction press will, of course, know that they are recruiting at the moment for those authorised officers. So if you're a building surveyor or a construction professional, and you feel like a change of job, then there are plenty of opportunities available for you with the building safety regulator. Now, in terms of discharging their duties, they have to engage with the accountable person through the certification process and the building safety case, which has to be provided to the building safety regulator every 5 years. As I've mentioned enforcement, I won't mention it again. But in relation to the accountable person, the building safety manager, there are particular offences that can be committed by both of those. So I'm going to move very, very quickly on to the accountable person, because a lot of people have been talking about the building safety manager, and a lot of energy and focus and time has gone into trying to work out how building safety managers are going to be identified and employed. And I completely understand that as an organisation, the recruitment of a building safety manager is going to be paramount. But one of the things that seems to have been lost in the mist somewhat, in my view, is that who is going to take on the role and the obligations of the accountable person, because they are the cornerstone of the occupation duties under this bill. And so often you hear people talk about the building safety manager, but they do not talk about the obligations that the accountable person has to discharge, which are very significant indeed, and if you get them wrong, carry with them very significant and serious criminal penalties. So what does a building accountable person rather have to do? Well, they have to register the building with the regulator prior to occupation. Forget certificates of practical completion, they're irrelevant now. You can't occupy your building unless you have a certificate of occupation from the building safety regulator. You have to produce your building safety case every 5 years in order for your building assurance certificate to be validated, and it is an offence to occupy a building without a building assurance certificate. And this is really where it gets very, very important, and I think where people slightly take their eye off the ball in terms of what the bill expects the accountable person to do. The accountable person has to carry out regular assessment of building safety risks. That is not a job for the building safety manager. That is a job for the accountable person. They have to appoint a building safety manager, but it is the accountable person who is responsible. The buck stops with the accountable person in terms of assessing risk. And that's a whole panoply of risk, from fire risk assessments to risks in relation to lift shafts, to all the things that might give rise to a risk of fire or structural collapse or problems with structural safety. The accountable person has to take all reasonable steps to prevent a major incident being one that gives rise to a large number of deaths or significant numbers of people with serious injury. And they have to develop a resident engagement strategy. And that, if you look at our latest piece on the white paper, I set out in that the sort of things that you're going to have to think about in order to come up with a resident engagement strategy. It is going to be a complex but practically focused piece of work, and it will be necessary, because if you don't do it, you're committing a criminal offence. And those are just some of the relevant requirements. And of course, if you fail to comply with any of these relevant requirements and you don't have a reasonable excuse, and your failure to do so gives rise to a critical risk, that is a risk of death or serious injury, then you have committed an offence, and the consequences of that can be quite serious in terms of a fine. So that's a very, very quick canter through the accountable person. I'll talk about the building safety manager for just a few minutes. The building safety manager is the person appointed by the accountable person. And what they're obliged to do in circumstances where they're a corporate body is they have to appoint a nominated person, and that is because residents, and in particular the resident panel, need to have a human being to contact as opposed to a corporate entity. There remains a very large issue in the sector generally about whether the building safety manager is going to be, the obligations of the building safety manager are going to be discharged by an individual or by a consultancy. And to a large extent, that depends on the size of the organisation. So what do they have to do? Well, they have to manage the building in accordance with the safety case and risk assessments. That is the safety case put together by the accountable person and the risks assessed by the accountable person, not the building safety manager. They have to give the regulator prescribed information at prescribed intervals. And this is another example, and there are many in the building safety bill, where we have yet to see the underlying regulation that is going to give some meaning to these provisions. So we don't quite know what the information is or when we have to provide it. But we do know that the building safety manager is going to have to maintain all relevant information about the building in a prescribed format. That will be electronic, and it's not going to be BIM, that the government aren't going to prescribe that. But frankly, unless you have a 3D model of your building, and unless you've got very good information, it remains difficult to see how you're going to comply with the obligations. And you have to operate a complaint system as part of the residents' engagement strategy. Curiously, the accountable person has to set up the resident panel. It has to produce the engagement strategy, but it is the building safety manager who has to deal with complaints. And of course, all of that is subject to a compliance notice regime. So insofar as the building safety manager is unable to comply with their obligations, the building safety regulator can issue a compliance notice, and that raises all sorts of questions about PI and other things that are still yet, frankly, to be even remotely satisfactorily addressed. So that's all I was going to talk about. There are other important aspects of the bill, but if you want more, then I suggest you keep an eye out for our upcoming seminars, which will be in significantly more detail. So I'll hand over, I think, to you now, Peter.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Morning, everybody. Thanks, Mark. Can I also thank everybody that completed the questionnaire? I think Catherine's going to look at that later and give some feedback on that, which does have an effect on one of the reasons why we have looked at this seminar today. What Mark has spoken about does imply some significant changes to the way in which we will have to run our projects. And a key area of that is risk management. And given the changes to regulatory reform, insurance and the lending environment, there's a case to say that we not only need to change it, but we need to improve the way that our projects are managed. Oh, well. Right. So why should we look at a new approach? Well, I think we've got to end the risk dumping culture that's become endemic. And I'm sure many of you have been watching the evidence from Grenfell will probably agree that scheme is not unique. We also, and Mark's touched on this, is the availability of comprehensive PI insurance. That has been the comfort blanket of risk management for many RPs and local authorities. There's somebody to sue, there's somebody to recover against. Well, if those organisations no longer have PI insurance, other than sending them bust, who picks up the bill? It's going to be the property owner. Judith Hackett spoke about recommendations to changing procurement. And again, that's a strong area for change. The business case, there's clearly a business case. In the work that I'm doing on external wall surveys and EWS1 forms, we're encountering huge cost liabilities, as well as some short-term problems from lenders, which, despite what was announced on Saturday, I don't think is going to go away. Finally, we all need to ensure that buildings that we're involved in are safe to live in and not assume that the responsibility is down to somebody else. We need to check the checkers. So what is the problem? Well, Dame Judith refers to design and build, and after every reference to design and build, she inserts in inverted commas value engineering. The Cole report in 2016 talked about the public sector risk dumping. And I still come across the belief that a cost that is too good to be true will deliver a quality project. Are public procurement regulations to blame? Only if they're, in my view, only if there's an overemphasis on cost or an inappropriate means of defining quality. And likewise, a failure to properly scope the services to ensure they're complied with. We're in a competitive environment. We're not going to price what people want. We're going to price what they say they want on their tender documents. Dame Judith also cited design and build as an area for gaming by the industry. And again, I think there's been sufficient evidence of that coming out of the Grenfell inquiry to support that claim. The consequences, we probably all know what the consequences are. The cheapest price is not always the best value for money. Your whole life costs are going to be greater. And fundamentally, we're making compromises to the safety of the people that are going to occupy these buildings. Design and build, in my view, does place a greater obligation on the employer to check, monitor and validate what is going on right the way throughout the process. And I'm afraid that very often gets put to one side. There's also very often a lack of understanding of how a building is designed and operates. Again, citing Grenfell, the gap, the distance between the client and the organisations producing insulation is huge. There's no close relationship between the design and the client that we used to have with traditional contracting. There's also greater conflict between the parties, both during and after construction, which my colleagues here today are quite obviously involved in. But fundamentally, we do come back to the fact that, you know, buildings are not safe for residents to live in. And I have witnessed myself some of the opening up works we've done to buildings, and I am ashamed of my industry that allows such poor workmanship to prevail. Procurement, I spoke about procurement. If an employer allows insufficient time and budget to produce a comprehensive tender, it's effectively dumping an undefined risk onto a contractor who have to price for it. We also have a very relaxed approach to qualifications and post-tender amendments, and all that does, I'm afraid, is encourage unscrupulous contractors to do it even more. Two-stage tendering a couple of years back seemed to be the way, together with joint ventures, but I'm again afraid that contractors are using a driver of cost and margin, not value. So those approaches have to be managed very carefully. Again, if we're not allowed sufficient time to drill down into what the tenders produced are, it encourages more gaming. If a contractor knows we've got to get on site, then there will be a bit of a standoff. So robust procurement approaches, for me, has to be at the centre of risk management. I'll come back to design and build again. Is it fit for purpose? It's a question that's been asked of a lot of people at the moment. And I always sort of add, well, whose fault is it that it's not? Dame Judith Hackett felt that it wasn't appropriate. But I come back to this point, how does a contractor define and properly price undefined risk in 6 weeks? You know, are the current contract amendments fair, reasonable and workable with the changes to the PI landscape? And I know that's something that Mark and Catherine are looking at. Is the de-risking, optimisation, value engineering not best placed pre-planning procurement stage, like a commercial developer would? It does require capacity and skill sets, however, to be able to manage that, particularly in the public sector. And I do believe that that will be difficult to achieve, but it is essential if we're going to affect a change in risk management. The construction phase, you know, is the cost saving on reduced site inspections worth it? I'm very often asked, can you reduce your fee? We only want 1 inspection a month. Well, I'm not sure that's worth it. And if you've got nobody to sue as a result now, then it definitely isn't worth it. Making sure you get the right skills. We are going to have to embrace the digital data requirement that has been developed under the latest BS, which will land, I'm told, in the summer for a building safety case and the golden thread, because you're going to need that information even for buildings below 18 or 11 metres to get your fire risk assessments. We need to adopt a no paperwork, no PC policy, and contractors have to understand that's what you will do. And Mark has just identified that legally you will have to do that now. I think we also need to accelerate the understanding of the benefits of BIM and a common data environment. Very little. There was very little feedback on use of common data environments from the questionnaire that we sent out. We also need to help, I believe, increase the demand for our immature MMC industry, which has some benefits in increasing quality, but it needs to be gone at a slow pace, but it needs to be gone at on a consistent base. I don't believe any risk management approach can rely on consultants and contractors to do what they should do. It's a sad indictment, but I think the evidence is out there that that is naive at best. So we need greater oversight at all stages of the process. To summarise, this obviously is my thoughts. The public sector, if they want to be a commercial developer, then procure like one. Upskill your resource, be accountable, and use properly competent support. Many, I have to say, are. End the risk dumping culture, properly scope and specify your services that you require to de-risk design, in particular pre-planning and pre-tender, and get rid of any reference to ECLAW approved in your documentation. No private sector developer that I know puts their brands in the hands of an unmanaged architect or a design and build contractor. And I don't believe the public sector should. I come back to my little phrase which irritates my staff: check the checkers. Clients need to commit adequate budgets for their design, development and procurement, ensuring consultants are competent and properly scoped. And Hackett's recommendation for leaders to improve competence and accountability across the sector are relevant, but I do appreciate that's a major challenge for our industry. In concluding, the suggestions that I have for better risk management and changing the way that we do things is that design and build is, I believe, a satisfactory means of procurement, but it can't be used as a tool to put undefined risk onto a contractor. I think if the public sector understands that it's necessary to invest in due diligence and design development, whilst the project is in their control pre-tender, they will get value for money. That money has to be spent, so why not have control over it? Hackett says improving procurement processes will play a large part in setting the tone for any construction project and drive the right behaviours. I agree totally. And fundamentally, I believe that what we need to do is we need to produce better tender documents, a better inspection regime, and you'll get a better end product. Check the checkers. Thank you.
Okay. Is that your last slide, Peter?
It is, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. It worked. Excellent stuff. Thank you very much, Peter and Mark. My name's Catherine Quiggerman. I'm a partner in Mark's team, the construction team at Devonshires. So we've heard from Mark a whistle-stop tour, if you like, of the impending legislative changes, and Peter's given his helpful views on actual, the risk management behind your contracts. What I want to finish with is a short section on contract amendments. And I know from the survey that many of you have filled in, and thank you for that, a lot of the responses said that there's no plan in your organisations to review your standard, assuming JCT, amendments at the moment. But I would urge you to start planning to look at it. I'm not suggesting you need to rewrite your contracts in any way, but I think it's the right time to be considering what your contracts say and understanding what your obligations are likely to be with the legislative changes, and thinking about whether your contracts are sort of fit for purpose and will enable you to comply with your obligations. So I would just sort of, that's the food for thought really that I want to come out of my slot today. So in terms of contracting, will the changes have an impact? I think in short, they should, for all of the reasons that Peter has touched on really. And I'm not suggesting at all that design and build is not fit for purpose. My view is that I think it is completely sufficient. But I do think we need to consider the relationship both between the employer and the contractor and also the wider design team, and how that is going to work in terms of the obligations that you're going to need to comply with. So thought is needed, but I think we've got what we need. We just need to make sure that it's working properly. So I've put on there some thoughts, some questions that I think you should be thinking about. So the procurement routes Peter has touched on, but I do think we're going to need more collaboration. And I think that's with the contractor, but also the design teams. And as Peter was saying, at as early as possible in this stage. And when we're thinking about how we're going to record this information, the first thing that people start talking about is BIM, and nobody really knows what that might mean for them. But I do think that from the client side, thinking as early as possible about scheme, about what you might need at the end of the construction stage is very, very important. You can't enter a contract and then think occupation, right, we now need to have all of this information to get sign off for occupation, and then ask the contractor for it. You've got to start thinking at the very earliest time what you need and how that might play into the design. So collaboration is going to be very, very key. And that removal of risk that Peter was talking about. In terms, other questions that spring to my mind is the gateways, and we'll talk a little bit in a moment about information that might be required, particularly at Gateway 2 construction and Gateway 3 occupation. But when you're looking at your contracts, I would urge you to think about how you want to deal with things like delay and cost risk at those stages, particularly where it's a hard stop stage. So are you going to try and just stick it all onto your contractor and say, right, if there's a delay because we can't get sign off, that's all your problem, Mr. Contractor? Or are we going to collaborate in some way? So all those sorts of things, how your contract sits alongside these gateways, and not just your contract, your appointment documents as well, but that needs to be considered, I think, as early as possible. I've popped in the use of technology there. We have had a question pop up. I may as well answer it now because it's a good time, about whether it's going to be mandatory to use BIM. And I think, as both Mark and Peter have said, it's not at the moment a mandatory requirement that BIM itself is used. But what I would say, and I would echo exactly what Mark and Peter have said, is that in looking at all this information and these duties that you're going to have to comply with, how are you going to comply with that if you're not in some way keeping a digital record that may not be high level BIM, but BIM to some extent? So I think technology is going to have to be used here, because in my view, I'm not sure how you're going to be able to comply with all of the things that you're going to have to comply with if you don't start to use technology in some way. There we go. Oh, sorry, wrong way. There we go. So when I'm thinking about contractual changes themselves, I've split it in my mind into three sections. Buildings that are already in occupation, so your existing stock. Buildings that are sort of pie in the sky a little bit at the moment and are not anywhere near design stage. And then those that are on site but not yet in construction. So I've split it into those three areas. So firstly, buildings that are already in occupation. I've mentioned the combined advice note there from January this year. I'm conscious of time, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. I'm sure that you're all aware of what the requirements are, the government guidance, what they said in January about checking your stock. But I think the key here is it's a risk assess based process, And I want to come on in the question and answer session about what the survey results said about that. But I think it's really, really key, if you are not already taking this seriously and getting to grips with your stock and starting to risk assess and put them in a priority list, then you really need to start thinking about that now, for all the reasons that Mark said at the very beginning. And I've put on there again, how are you going to collate this information? So you know from what Mark has said, you're going to have to comply with the Fire Safety Act, FRAs. How are you going to do that? How are you going to collate the information to give to your fire risk assessors? Have you got any information at the moment about your existing buildings? Do you need to do a full scan of your building? Because there are processes that you can do that. Is it just that you want maybe to do some 3D photographs of your rooms that you'll be able to keep a digital record of what's in your building? There are lots and lots of technical or technology options out there to help you collate the information. But clearly the starting point with existing buildings is, what have you got at the moment, and where do you need to fill in those gaps to be able to comply in the years to come with your legislative requirements. Now, in terms of buildings that are currently being contemplated, so there's no contract in place, there's no detailed design, they're at very, very early stages. I would be looking to look at what your contracts say at the moment and whether we need to bolster it and change it and add to it in any way. And those that I've listed there are sort of the key things that I would start thinking about. So quality and checking. So, can you put provisions in your contract to require the contractor to check certain things? So it may be, for example, that you want them, the contractor, to take a photo of every cavity barrier that they install, for example. Now, that's quite easy for a contractor to do. It's probably not likely that your EA or your clerk of works is going to be on site when every single cavity barrier is installed. But you could require that of your contractor, and then your EA can has something to check against to see what they've been doing, rather than knowing that they're going to be covering things up. So it's things like that that you could be putting as specific requirements into your contract on your contractors, and also require a digital record of what they're doing, because again, as I say, I know that lots of people are not having checkers on site all the time. It's just not doable. So having some sort of record from your contractor that is more than just the monthly written records would be very, very helpful, and it will enable your EA to exercise their powers under the contract for things like opening up, and where they suspect there are defects, they will have ammunition to be able to comply, to instruct those opening up works. In terms of materials, I would say two things really. The first thing is, and both Mark and Peter touched on this, is specifically say to your contractor, you cannot, all combustible materials are prohibited. So something very simple like that. But also a second layer is, you may want to have a system whereby, for example, the contractor has to suggest materials to you before construction work starts, and so that there is dialogue there. But in addition to that, I think you would also want to be thinking about requiring manufacturers' information, any test result information. So again, you have that digital information, you know what materials are in your building. As Peter said, it's not an equal to requirement, it is, we want this, we don't want that. And also it gives you that information to build your building safety case, to give to your fire risk assessors for fire risk assessments, to complete EWS1 forms. So it's starting to think about those requirements and sitting requirements in your contract, so you get the information that you need at the end. And just finally, very quickly, buildings under construction. So you're already on site, but you're not at PC yet. Think about your contracts and what rights you have in there to check what work's being done. So the right to open up, for example, use it, but obviously be aware that if you don't find a compliance issue, there are ramifications to that for the client. Do you need additional support on site? Having resource there now is going to be better than having a problem in 2 years' time. So think about what support you have got there to either check digital records of what the contractor has done or actually check on site what they are doing. So check, which is Peter's favourite phrase. So in conclusion, my view is that design and build is still fit for purpose. I've heard it bandied about quite a lot recently that it possibly isn't, and we're going to need to think about procurement options. I don't think that is the case, but I do think we need to invest that time and money at the front end, both in terms of thinking about risk, but also about how all the parties are coming together and understanding what information you need at the end to comply with those requirements at occupation stage in particular and beyond. There's no point thinking about it halfway through construction. You've got to think about it at the beginning. And if you've got works on site already, do consider what your contract says already. And we all know it goes in a drawer and we never look at it. But think about what teeth you've got in that contract to start checking. And if there are failures to comply, what you can do about it. I would just make 2 further points just about the survey results that we've had in. I think I mentioned at the beginning that I noticed a lot of people had said they weren't planning on looking at their amendments, and I've spoken about that. But I do note that the vast majority of people that did comment said that their contract, this is the JCT contracts, do have it as a condition to PC that all information listed is provided by the contractor, and I think that's pretty standard now, particularly in D&B contracts. But there are so many times that we see, and Peter will know this from his experience, that clients are so desperate to take handover for various different reasons that is very often sort of scratched over, and there may be information missing, but PC is given and handover is taken. So just be careful about that, and also review that information that is required for PC, because that will need to be bulked out considerably, whether it's in your JCT amendments or otherwise in other documentation that form part of the contract. But just be very clear about what you require at PC, and don't be too keen to take handover if that information is not required. It has not been provided. Okay, so I think that brings us to the end. There have been a couple of questions. So as I say, one of them was about the requirement to use BIM, but another one, and maybe this is sort of for you, Mark, after your talk. But has there been any clarification at all about the information that's going to be required?
Well, there's going to be a British standard that will set out and prescribe exactly what has to be within the safety case. I mean, the safety cases have been produced as part of the pilot scheme, and I've seen some of those, and they are very significant documents. But in terms of what it's going to look like and what you're going to have to put in it, that will all form part of the new BS. I think it's 8644 that's due to come out next year. So watch that space. But just echoing the point that you make, it is absolutely the case that you have to now start thinking about gathering those information requirements, because building safety cases will have to be provided for existing buildings as well. So even if you're going to start on site in a couple of months' time and you're going to be finished in the end of next year, if you're building a high-risk building, you're going to have to need all this information. So you should be thinking about amending your contracts to bring into those contracts all the information that you're going to need, and we can obviously assist people in doing that. And so that was that point.
Yeah. There's a question on a couple of questions about insurance. So contractors reporting and telling clients that their insurers or their designers' insurers cannot offer PI without a fire safety works exclusion, which is what you picked up on, Peter. So do you want to sort of kick off on that, Peter?
Yeah, I think we've found it's not just contractors, it's everybody in the sector. My broker told me that the figure going around for architects that don't have cover for fire now is something like 87%. We're commonly coming across contractors that have exclusions on fire safety work. It's very interesting that the notifications you get that identify the cover have now slightly changed, and that there is no exclusions shown on the cover notes, and we have to go and ask for those. And then you find that there is an exclusion for fire safety works. And I'm increasingly seeing the word both directly and indirectly. And you have to wonder, well, what are the insurers actually covering? You know, this is why I think we have to change the approach that employers have to managing their contracts. Because if that PI doesn't exist, you won't get far basically going off, unless it's a really large contractor and you settle on a recovery over years and years and years. The fact of the matter is smaller designer build contractors will go bust. And that's why we don't have many small designer build contractors, because they've already gone. So it's quite common. You know, I don't think there's anything you can do about it. You know, we've had an announcement on Saturday saying that the government are going to work with the insurance industry to provide PI. Well, that's a joke. I mean, nobody's going to, you know, I was talking to a broker the other day who got, in one day, got £17 million worth of claims in on the result of opening up works to his insured construction projects. Why would they want to actually go and cover somebody who was a fire assessor to then go and do EWS1 forms? They'd be mad to do it.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I mean, to answer your question, Chandra, which is wonderfully on point, the PI insurance market is running away from the construction sector at a rapid rate of knots, because the PI market has seen the horrors that we have all seen, and where they are picking up the tab at the end of the day, yes, they will have reinsurance and reinsurance, but the risk is very, very high. So what we're finding, certainly in terms of cladding remediation projects, is there are a very small number of contractors out there who are prepared to do it on any basis where they are taking design responsibility, even if it's only a small design design portion. Most contractors are saying to us, we cannot get PI cover to cover any element of design. And what's that? And that's leading to some quite comical situations where you're having contractors turn around to you and say, well, you need to tell me how I put the screws into this panel to put it on the external wall, because that is a design issue. That is not a workmanship issue. So we're having all these issues around whether something is design or workmanship. But, you know, I have some sympathy with contractors in this position, because the PI market is simply not there to support them. Now, you can get PI insurance. Anyone can get insurance for anything, but the premiums are eye-wateringly huge, and very quickly becomes uneconomic to pay them. So we're seeing a lot more of that, and what that's going to lead to inevitably is the abandonment of design and build, and the a more sort of old-fashioned approach where the employer is responsible for the design and the Contractor builds it to that design and may only take a small design portion. So with the design and build contracting, and I completely agree with Catherine, I think, we make the changes to the design and build process that we're recommending this morning. It is a perfectly acceptable way forward, but you have to do a lot more than has been done previously. But going forward, the existence of design and build will be insurance-led. And at the moment, at least, it's not looking good for that particular mode of construction.
Just picking up on that point, there's been a question about sort of procurement routes, about, given that we're suggesting that clients are going to have, a much greater early input at the early design stage, will it become the norm that employers, architects will be novated over to the main building contractor? And that's sort of what you're touching on, Mark. And
procurement's going to change dramatically.
Indeed,
it's going to look nothing like it is at the moment.
But that setup where an employer's design team is novated, I think is very, very prevalent in the private sector. And I used to work with a lot of private developers, and that is absolutely what they did, because they wanted full control at the design stage. And so they had their architects, and then once the building contractor was brought on board, they usually architect, sometimes a structural as well, was novated across, which is then going into what you were suggesting, Mark, about it being design and build, but a slightly nuanced form where the contractor builds what you've designed, with potentially some element of design portion. So I can see that happening, but I don't think that is actually unusual outside our sector.
No, it's not. I mean, coming back to Peter's point, I mean, we're going to see two entirely different procurement regimes, one for higher risk buildings and one for buildings that are below 11 or 18 metres or whatever it ultimately settles on. And there will be different sets of consultants and different sets of contractors who will be qualified to work on both. I mean, some contractors simply won't be able to work on high risk buildings because they won't get the public liability or professional indemnity insurance. Similarly with consultants. So we're going to have two entirely separate regimes in due course. And in terms of how we procure high risk buildings, it is inevitably going to involve a two-stage process with pre-construction services, because ultimately the contractor is going to have to become an intimate part of that design process, because Gateway 2 requires you to pretty much have a fully designed and fully developed product. So you can't do it on the hoof. You're going to have to put in a lot more investment and a lot more time to get the design sorted before you put a spade in the ground.
That's exactly correct, because what you're going to have to do is have your building regs approval before you can actually start on site. So for high rise buildings over 18, that's going to become the norm. And the issues, I think, for clients will be the competence of an architect to take a scheme beyond 3 some can do that, some can't. So are they technically capable of doing that? And that obviously was an issue that was raised in the Grenfell inquiry regarding the competence of the architect. So yeah, a lot of people are saying what I'm looking at is a glorified design and dump instead of design and build. Well, to be honest with you, I think that's probably going to be the safest approach for a client to take, to have total control over that design process. And if it just encourages contractors to price the job properly, then I haven't got a problem with that. And if we get 4 prices with, you can throw a blanket over all of them, well, they're all going to the same, virtually the same subcontractors, et cetera, et cetera. When you get something that's hanging out the bottom, you know there's something wrong and somebody's going to try and recover that margin. So the answer here is yes, we will have to look very closely at how we go about procuring.
Yeah. There will inevitably be a change, and we're already looking at how that's going to work and trialing some weird and wonderful ways of doing it that comply with the gateways and get clients the product that they want at the end of the day. But there's a lot more legwork to be done up front, a lot more collaboration, and a lot more mixing up of who employs the design team and who takes responsibility for the design team at that early stage. An interesting question from Catherine, which is all of the changing legislation seems to refer to high-rise buildings. How will regulations apply to low-rise but still high-density developments, i.e. a large block of flats that is only 4 floors. Well, Catherine, that won't be a high risk building for the purposes of the building safety bill, and so that won't be overseen by the building safety regulator, and you won't have to comply with the various gateways in relation to the construction of that sort of building. But it will fall into the auspices of the fire safety bill. So you will have to check the external wall system, and insofar as there are problems with it, you will have to carry out whatever remediation work is necessary. So, and of course, the other thing is that if you're building, and lots of people have said to me, well, we're just not going to build high-risk buildings now. We'll start building lots and lots of buildings at sort of 4 or 5 stories. We're not going to build 18 meters or above, or 6 stories and above, because that's just going to give rise to this regime, which is going to cause us enormous problems. Well, number one, that's not a realistic proposition for most, certainly most members of the G15, but certainly secondly, insofar as you're going to be building lots of smaller buildings, then you're still going to have to do the things that we are suggesting, because you're still going to have to make sure that your external wall system, for example, has been constructed correctly. So all the things that we're advising you to do in relation to high-risk buildings do, to a large extent, need to be replicated on those lower-rise buildings as well. And if you look at the stuff that's garnered the headlines over the past couple of years, cases that Catherine and I have been involved in, Worcester Park and others, Samuel Garside House, these were all buildings well below 18 metres, but involved elements of either in terms of timber frame construction or timber balconies that gave rise to the risk and caused significant risk of injury and death to residents. So, you know, it doesn't really matter in many respects. The lessons from Grenfell and the lessons from what's happened over the past couple of years mean that we have to take the sort of approach we're now going to have to apply to high risk buildings and apply that to lower risk buildings as well.
Yeah. I think there's just been one final question here, referring to building regs, building regulation 38, assuming the 2010 building regs, which says that could we just request that the contractor complies with building regulation 38 and provide that that's a compulsory requirement of PC, but a lot of clients aren't necessarily aware of that. So where we were just talking about having, you know, having in your contract specific requirements and looking at what your PC requirements are, should we also be referring to building regulation 38, which say that regulation states that the contractor has to provide fire safety information about the work that they have done. I mean, obviously, under the JCT or a building contract, they have to comply with the building regulations and statutory requirements. But when I'm drafting a building contract, I look very specifically at what I would want, or what my client would want at PC. So I wouldn't necessarily just rely on that blanket building reg. I would want to be looking specifically at what you want the contractor to provide, because they've got to comply with that building regulation anyway.
You absolutely have to be prescriptive. Yeah, agreed.
You're correct there, because I think building reg 38 doesn't really define exactly what you need.
Right.
It's quite broad, isn't it?
Yeah. BSI are working on a British standard for this. I think it comes out in February for consultation, and it should give us all a proper steer. They've given it a BS number. I think we're advising that if that BS number goes in as a requirement, it gives you a bit more of a steer as to what may be required, because the problem is that if we just rely on building reg 38, it doesn't actually say what's required and what isn't. So it's the criticism of our building regs is that it is just a basis for compliance, but there's no firm guidance there.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think looking down our question list, I think we have covered them all. So unless Mark and Peter, you had anything else you wanted to add, I think
just to say that those of you who are interested will no doubt have picked up on the very interesting press release that the government issued on Friday in relation to EWS1 forms. And Peter and I have spoken about this morning. We've both written articles about it, which are available from all good websites, of course. And so what the government has essentially said is that in conjunction with the RICS and the association of, I think it's the organisation that looks after building societies, of which there are 42 or so in the UK, EWS1 forms will no longer be required where the building is not cladded. It's a rather arbitrary position that raises, I think, more questions than it answers. But for more information on that, I recommend that you visit a well-known website and get that information.
Good. Well, I think that probably brings us to a conclusion, and we've done the hour, so we've kept on time. But thank you very much for logging in. Hope you found it helpful, and we will be sending the slides to you by email. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.